All right, hello everybody out there in Video Lab land. Thank you for joining me today. This video, if you do not know, is all about how you search for something like the grawlix in archival records, which is kind of tricky because the grawlix is always different. You can't search for the word grawlix, you can't search for random characters. So how do you find the oldest grawlix? The first thing I want to credit is LanguageLog and Ben Zimmer, who did the early research into it. However, we did find a lot of grawlixes that were earlier than the previously known first grawlix, so I want to go through exactly how I did it. I'm going to start you out here with a beautiful picture of Rudolf Dirks, the creator of the Katzenjammer Kids. It's pretty awesome. I would love to learn more about his and his brother Gus Dirks' life. But that's a story I'll save for another time. Feel free to ask me if you want to know the incredible tale behind them. Now, going into this though, I want to give you an idea of how I typically assemble this kind of timeline and how I create a search record that I think ends up working pretty well. So the first step I take is I always create a timeline. So what does that mean? Basically, I'm assessing all the evidence I find and then I organize it in order from the earliest to the latest. So as you can see here, I have a jumble of research, and then I kind of start in the early 1900s. Here I have some examples, and I'm just basically trying to lay them out in order so that I have a general sense of what's going on. And in this case, it started in around the 1890s, something like that. Here's an 1898, 1897, and then it goes to 1906. The reason that I say this first is because no matter how much research you do, you want to have a sense of the overall general arc of things. So something like the grawlix, it's really tough to find specific evidence, and the best you can do is to give the viewer or the reader a picture of all the work that you've put in, and you get that picture by forming a timeline. So just to give you a couple of concrete examples, one of my first entries in a timeline here is from 1897, well before any of the grawlixes that we know. Now, if you look at my screen, you can see this doesn't have any grawlixes, but it does give us a clue as to the time. There's music being used here in the notes, and there are also captions that kind of give us some grounding as to the sort of techniques that were being used in comics. However, there are not speech bubbles. So that's kind of giving me a lay of the land just to have the earliest part of my timeline assembled. Then moving down, if I go to the latest part of my timeline, I found one in 1907, and by then I'd found enough grawlixes that I kind of decided nothing new and interesting was going on. But here's a Katzenjammer article from 1907, and boom, there's your beautiful grawlix. So you can also see that speech bubbles are being used. The panels are still numbered, but there are not captions. So we're sort of getting a lay of the land by assembling in this timeline, figuring out all the gaps in between, and allows us to make these imprecise conclusions about when the first grawlix was at least a little more likely to be correct. Hopefully I gave you that sense in the video that while we did find the first known grawlix, that could be subject to change. Maybe after watching this video, you'll do your own research and you'll find an earlier one. That would make my day. Now, the second thing I want to go over is how do I actually search for something like this? And that is all about compiling as many resources as possible. Now, this tutorial is not going to be telling you, okay, subscribe to newspapers.com. That's how you do this. It's going to be about telling you to have an array of sources. So in this case, that was the Library of Congress via their index Chronicling America, but also their normal collection. That was newspapers.com, which is an invaluable resource. And it was also DPLA, which is the Digital Public Library of America. They're basically a search engine for a bunch of easily accessible and typically usable collection items. And the reason that I mention those three is not to recommend those three specific resources, but to recommend that you do searches across all of them, because things that won't result in a hit in one search engine will result in a hit in another. And it's really important to be thorough and to just go through each one with the same searches so that you're uncovering all the possible data. So let's get down to brass tacks here. The search term that you use. Now, this is the really important part with something like the grawlix. I'm going to go ahead and click to a sample comic here from Chronicling America. Now, this is from the Katzenjammer Kids. I knew from my early research looking at Language Log and Ben Zimmer that Katzenjammer Kids was one of the earliest grawlixes. So I decided to try to look at as many Katzenjammer Kids as possible. Right here, though, you'll notice the problem. See this comic headline? It does not say Katzenjammer Kids. It has a title, but it doesn't say the comic's name. So that makes it really tough to search for. And so when you're searching through archival stuff like this, you need to have the mentality of creativity in your search, because the OCR, the optical character recognition, is not perfect in these old newspapers. It's incredible. It's incredibly good, but it's not perfect. And moreover, the titling systems are not going to be consistent. So you need to be looking for little back ways into searching for stuff that can find you new evidence. So I'm going to use the Katzenjammer Kids as an example because I initially thought they would be the first grawlix. So right here, I know that Katzenjammer is a good phrase. So even just by, I'll go ahead and open a new tab. We'll conduct these in Chronicling America, even though newspapers.com ended up being more fruitful for me. So even just by searching for Katzenjammer, I get a ton of hits. If I sort by date, then I start getting a lot more false positives. This is going to be inadvertent sponsored content for Just Fawn's series, False Positive, because I get a lot of false positives on these search results. So what I did here was I just limited the search to 1896 to 1963, and then it resorts by relevance. So then I'm going to sort it by date again. And so that's kind of constraining my search to the general realm of possibility. You want to make sure to have your search time frame go beyond when you think the first Katzenjammer Kid occurred or whenever your first search term occurred, just to make sure that you're getting everything, because people are wrong a lot of the time. For Lady Bountiful, one of the Wikipedia pages, or one of the comic historian pages actually, that I saw said that the first comic was in 1902, but I found a bunch of examples in 1901. So you always want to overcheck and just assume that everybody is wrong or off by at least a few years. And so basically, yeah, now I'm weeding through all these every time the word Katzenjammer has appeared. And I'm just looking for any results that I can find. And basically, this just means going through it again and again. As you can see, there aren't a ton of results here. And so in the case of Katzenjammer Kids, for my search, I ended up having to be real creative. So the kids in Katzenjammer are Hans and Fritz. And so one of the searches that I did was I did Hans plus Fritz, and looking for any article in which Hans and Fritz appeared. And they showed up a lot. There were a lot of results here. Now, it gets more complicated when you start sorting by date. All those relevance searches are really gratifying. All these date searches here, not so much. You've got a lot more weeding through to do. You've got to narrow your date again. But as you can see, figuring out more creative search terms really does result in a lot of stuff that you wouldn't have found otherwise. And that was the case with searching for Hans and Fritz. Again, I'm kind of going back here. I'm back in 1896 again. One of my favorite searches that I did to find Katzenjammer Kids comics, and I did find quite a few, was I noticed that the main characters speak in this sort of pidgin English that's supposed to be like a fake German immigrant accent or something. I have no idea if this is something people would be offended by or not. They might be reasonable. Okay, here's a Hans and Fritz from 1904. And these are the Katzenjammer Kids. They're getting spanked. But you can see right here, like, we never would have found this if we'd searched for Katzenjammer Kids. But we found it now. And so one of my favorite searches, as I was saying, if you look right here, they say "der Captain" a lot in their weird sort of accented English, and they say "is" too. So it's easy to read this. So let's just search for that. And I bet if we do, we'll find something. We did. We found a lot. I knew that would happen. And so I found a lot of results just by searching for random unique terms that appeared in the comic, but weren't the name of the comic. And there's nothing more satisfying than finding a ton of comics that no one else would have ever found, or, regardless of your research process, finding stuff that nobody would have found before. So that's the big tip here. Use unique search terms. Assume that the OCR is irregular, not through any fault of them, but just because it's hard to read old text, and just be compulsive about going through stuff again and again and again, because you will find stuff that you wouldn't otherwise find. I mean, like right here, Cats and Jammer Kids, this comic, it gets complicated figuring out the taxonomy of these comics for reasons that are kind of beyond description here, but never would have found this example just by searching Cats and Jammer Kids. Never would have found it. Never would have found this one. Everybody's using different labels. So, and this is by Rudolf Dirks. So, all sorts of examples like this. And so after those alternate searches, it's key to go ahead and do all these searches in every resource that you have. In my case, I ended up finding that first grawlix in Lady Bountiful. And only did I find all those Lady Bountiful comics by searching across platforms. I would not have found it just by looking at Chronicling America, just at newspapers.com. By the way, I was very disappointed that Lady Bountiful was the first grawlix. I thought Cats and Jammer Kids were way funnier, but whatever. I found the first result though by looking across everything, and it was only on doing that, looking across all those resources, compiling the time frame, that I found an answer. And the cool thing is that if you search compulsively like this along the way, you're going to run into other stuff that is also interesting. I mean, I wasn't aware that Lady Bountiful was an archetype in this time period. The idea that you see expressed in the comics of a wealthy woman helping the poor, something like that. I haven't done any research into that, but that's something that I might look into for a future video, because it's bizarre that you run into this search term again and again and again, and I'd love to learn more about it. I'm betraying my ignorance here by admitting I don't know it, but there's a lot more to learn. So I did that search for Lady Bountiful across all these platforms, and that's the only reason that I found it. And then the final tip that I have for researching something like this is review your work. The first grawlix that I found when I was making the video, and it was more than a year earlier than the previous early grawlix that Ben Zimmer in Language Log, and then Kleefeld on Comics, he's another guy who did some work on this, the one that they found. And I only found it because I wanted to check my work over again. And when I was checking my work over, I discovered a whole cache of examples that came from the previous year. So never trust yourself to have done a sufficiently good job, and always be looking for an extra. I mean, I'm half nervous that I'm going to find another grawlix right now. But when you do check over your work again and again, you're performing a check against yourself. That's what you have to do in these research processes, because you're the only person doing this. There is not a definitive answer, so you have to develop a lot of different ways to review your work. Check it through multiple sources, check it through building a timeline, and check it through review. And by building these corrective elements, you can find a lot of really interesting things that you wouldn't have otherwise found. So yeah, those are my tips for finding something unusual like a grawlix. I'd say the take home, unusual search terms. Don't just search for a name, search for everything that relates to your topic of choice, because that's where you're going to find the gold that other lazier people did not find. And let's end this with a Cats and Jammer Kid comic. Looks like Hans and Fritzy are looking at a baby. Okay, this is one of their old tricks, which is to dress up an animal in human clothes. They're putting the cat in the crib, convincing mama that the baby is out and has had a disaster befall it. The baby jumps through the window. Mama's freaking out. The baby's in the tree. And they go up to get it. And then they find out the baby was a cat. Sorry, it's funny. It's funny. And you know what? You can bet that those cats and Jammer kids got spanked. Okay, so that is it. Thank you for watching. I know this is a little arcane, but I do think that it's so exciting to find something that people have not found before, even people who are really into this, and you can do it too. These resources are better than ever. This is data that is open to anybody, anywhere, and you can affect the record around the world. It can be for something trivial like the first grawlix, but it can also be for a topic that you view as important. And for me, the grawlix is very important stuff, but whatever your passion might be, you can find new history just by being a little more persistent than the person who did it before you. So thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll try to answer them either in the comments to this video or if you send me an email, I'm happy to there. All right, thanks, bye.